Well, I'd like to welcome you back and to this second session. Firstly, not to worry about me, I'm off camera. As somebody once said, I've got a great face for radio, so that's all right. I'll be letting the panel do the heavy lift. And this second session, the axis of upheaval, which follows on very nicely from the first session. I was slightly worried at one point that General Sir Tim was going to go off-piste quite a lot into this. He did obviously refer to, what did we say? Brink, was it? The Brink? Oh, the Brinks. And obviously we'll hear more about that. So I'm Andrew Stewart, I'm head of conflict research here. I will keep my comments very brief because you've not come to listen to me. The axis of upheaval, for those of you who are not aware of its origins or what I would perceive of its origins, it comes out of an American authored piece last year, published in Foreign Affairs. But why we're particularly interested in it, for those of you who were at the Land Warfare Conference last summer, CGS referred specifically to the axis. Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. From my perspective, what I would say is what's interesting about it, there are many things, as we're going to hear in the session that follows, but it's not an alliance, it's not a treaty, it's not a coalition. There's nothing formal about it. In fact, as General Sir Tim said, it's not even got a sort of shared ideology. There's no basis that's politically uniting or linking. There's nothing really necessarily obviously cohesive about it, other than here you have a group of actors, a group of countries who exist or seem to have as a key driver challenging the status quo, challenging the hegemony that's out there. I would ask the question, maybe to think about as we go through, are they just simply disruptors? So I'm a historian by background. Again, a lot of people have been quick over recent years to make parallels to the interwar period, and by that I mean between the first two major wars of the 20th century, not including the Cold War, and the parallels that exist with certain individuals and certain states during that period and how they went about their business. So are these disruptors, or are they expansionists? Is there something more beyond their actions and their rhetoric? Or are they both? Are they actually disruptors who might take advantage of how circumstances develop, whether as a result of their actions or by happy circumstance around them? And will they then seek to exploit, if you like, the conditions they're helping foment to other ends? So that's just in terms of my thinking. Now, what I'm going to do is, with the panel, because as those who know me would freely confess, I am a Luddite and I can barely make a computer work. But I am quite intrigued by the idea of QR codes, and hopefully all of you in the room have scanned the QR code, and therefore you have the full details of the panel. All I would just say is we've got Henry, Tracey, Ed and Ali. Now, within there we've got professors, we've got doctors, we've got think tank, we've got analysts, we've got academics, we've got researchers. What I would really say to those, we've got thinkers, and we've got four of the best thinkers on this. And I think actually it's very much in our interests to listen to their thoughts and what they've got to say about it. But do look at the QR, do look at the ridiculously short bio that we asked them to supply, which does not do justice to them, and hopefully be encouraged by that to do a little bit more research on them, because there may be strengths and weaknesses of the age we live in, but each of them has a significant body of work and research out there. You can quite easily find it, and you can read in more detail what they have to think. Running order, I propose to go Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. Hopefully about 45 minutes, and then to you and the floor, and hopefully some very interesting, not too challenging questions. Well, actually be as challenging as you want, and we'll hopefully have about 90 minutes. So without further ado, Russia. Russia,
I've become the representative for Russia. Thank you, Andrew, and thank you for the invitation. It's nice to be back. Many, many years ago, 2 decades ago, I used to teach up at Faraway Hall. So I'm very used to talking to an audience with the eyes going back like that. Bless the cadets. Anyway, yeah, Russia. There's been a lot of activity in the last week, both political and diplomatic fronts vis-à-vis Russia. If we think about what's happened this time last week with the UK signing its 100-year pact with Ukraine, and Russia Iran signing a comprehensive strategic partnership on the same day. All of this kind of activity as Trump was just preparing to return to the White House. And then on Wednesday this week, we had the Defence Minister's statement in the House of Commons describing Russia as the most pressing and immediate threat to the UK, and highlighted growing aggression targeting allies abroad and at home. None of this is new. Russia has been described as the most pressing immediate threat to the UK for a number of years now. And I think what we see from a Russian perspective, and in fact the language that we in the West, both the UK and our allies with regards to the international system, we're beginning to use the same language that Moscow has been using for over a decade now about competition, strategic competition and confrontation, unpredictability. And it feels like we're beginning to think in the same way. And the Kremlin has made it clear for over a decade that it sees the West as essentially an existential threat to Russia. Okay, and opposition to global influence of the West, and particularly to the spread of liberal democratic values, and that question that we had at the end of the last session about shared values versus shared interests was very interesting, and that has been a very, very long-running theme in Russian kind of foreign policy discourse, and particularly Putin's narratives. And I think what this means is that as we move forwards, we're likely to see more of the same. Andrew, you asked the question as to whether the states represented by this panel are disruptors, or this axis of upheaval. Are they states driven by anger and resentment at their treatment by the West and Western states and Western behaviour? Is that what they all have in common? What we've been seeing in terms of Russian discourse in recent years is this sense of a global competition for power and influence between the West and the rest. And this term world majority has started gaining traction amongst Russian analysts and scholars. One particular Russian scholar came up with this term world majority a couple of years ago now in a report, and it's gained traction. And what it's underlining from a Russian perspective is, yes, there's the West, but there are many others who have very different views. And I think when we look at Russia, a member of the panel this morning said that they're isolated internationally. I'm afraid I would disagree. I don't think they are isolated. And they don't feel themselves to be isolated either. There are many, many states in the world who either share similar views to Russia and to Moscow, or kind of, not fence-sitting, but are kind of in that camp, are unhappy with Western dominance, as they see it, of the international system. So what we've been seeing from Russia post-2022, since its invasion of Ukraine, is even more foreign policy activism, particularly targeting the global south. And I think this is an area from a UK and a Western perspective, which is perhaps one that we're not paying sufficient attention to. Particularly Africa. If you look at what Russia's been up to since 2022 in sub-Saharan Africa across the Sahel, we're talking about an axis of upheaval here. Some of the relationships that it's been building across what's been termed the coup belt of the Sahel is deliberately designed to undermine Western influence. Both from a Russian perspective, but also from some of these states, be that Mali, Niger. Chad is an interesting one, because that's obviously been a traditional US ally in the region, and there's been attempts to pull that into this kind of anti-Western orbit. And I think for the UK, so what for the UK? from my perspective, it's that this is about a global context, and are we thinking globally enough? Are we thinking about some of the challenges we face in an integrated enough kind of fashion? Because our adversaries, I think, are. And some of the reports that I've been reading from Russia, be that media, be it official reports, about why Russia is engaging with some of these states in Africa. There's the economic perspective, yes. There's the political, the diplomatic. But there is also the security aspects and the challenging the West. For example, the access to uranium in Niger. And some Russian analysts have made a direct link between preventing states such as France and others gaining access, having access to the uranium in that part of the world, and undermining European energy security. Now, are we joining the dots enough in terms of issues such as that? So I think, I've raised a lot of kind of broad issues there, but it's really just thinking about Russian activity, perhaps outside of direct areas of kind of interest for the UK now, but moving forwards that may well really challenge the UK and its allies in the medium to long term. And I wonder if we're thinking enough and taking enough action to do that. My second point, my final point really goes back to what John Healey was talking about on Wednesday, making Britain feel more secure at home. But he focused very much on the military means, obviously, he's Defence Minister. But it's in the non-military realm that I think the challenge may well and is kind of going to confront us, and particularly the divisions within society. And that comes back to that values versus interests conversation that we were having just before the break. And the anger that states around the world have at attempts by Western states to promote liberal democracy and liberal democratic values, but also the shared values, the importance of those values to us. And our society, our country, and many of those of our allies are built on liberal democratic values, which are a great strength, but also a critical vulnerability that many of our adversaries seek to exploit, Russia in particular. And I think when we're thinking about, so what for the UK and securing the UK, are we doing enough to make sure that society and societal resilience exists and is there, and that our societies are aware of the way that our adversaries exploit information, for example, and the direct links that have been found between Russia and the riots in the UK last year. And I think that is an area, again, outside of the direct kind of field of interest for the army, but nevertheless is a way that our own security in the short, medium and long term could be undermined. So I will leave it there and hand on to another disruptor.
I couldn't possibly say, but hopefully we'll find out.
Take the comment process. Right. So I put the China hat on today, fittingly an outsider to this august institution. I thought I'd start with, in the spirit of today, a question, and that is the US-China rivalry now the operational context for the rest of the world, and particularly when it comes to international security and international politics? Perhaps more pithily, is China now a superpower? If it isn't now, what would it take for it to become so? When it comes to resourcing, China certainly has the goods. It's the world's second largest economy. If I've done my maths right, its GDP is approaching £16 trillion now. It also has the world's second largest national R&D spend, which we estimated at about £370 billion in 2023. That's pretty nice. The spend helps fund 1.87 million research posts, which result in the world's largest output of published academic papers. I would value that from an academic organisation. China also possesses the world's largest reserves of rare earth minerals, so 44 metric tons. It's 44% of the world's known resources. It's also responsible for 69% of the current production of rare earth minerals, according to the United States government. On military terms, the People's Liberation Army remains the world's largest military by total number of personnel. It also has, by many metrics, the world's largest navy, which would be interesting for an island nation to think about. One recent US Army Science Board white paper cheerily concluded that most PLA capabilities are now recently acquired, technologically sophisticated, benefit from leading-edge technology, and are fielded in large numbers. Many are performing at or exceeding key aspects of US military capability. Or, to take it close to home, China is already the technological pacing threat in many areas of military technical capability for the UK, and is likely to become more so over time rather than less. Finally, adding all of that, highly likely, difficult to pin down, given how way Chinese bureaucracy works, that China possesses the world's largest combined intelligence apparatus. So, all in all, a fairly formidable set of building blocks for which to exercise national power from. To what end are these resources being put at the moment? Well, China has an explicitly stated vision for an alternative reformed world order, which, depending on translation, comes out to something like a community for the shared future of mankind or shared destiny of mankind. They've changed their translation a couple of times for interesting reasons. This is intentionally defined against what it presents as a United States' hegemonism and unilateralism in world affairs, and it has led to them to explicitly target this message at states in Africa, in Latin America, in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and also seek to co-opt or promote this message in multinational forum or in international bodies, including the United Nations. In my view, China's ambitions here to reshape the global order are a logical development of the Chinese Communist Party's driving principles. First, of maintaining its preeminence in China, shaping Chinese domestic politics to facilitate that. In order to do that, there is a logical drive to shape the region to China's benefit, to restore China to what it sees as its natural position in Asia. And then the logical consequence of that, as China has grown in economic and military strength, has been to take those ambitions into shaping the global order in order to help facilitate China's position. Pithily summarized by the slogan, rich country, strong military. I promise not to do too many Chinese slogans as we go through here. There are lots of them. China understands economic and military strength to be interdependent, with both based on successful strategic competition in the field of science and technology in particular. And this encapsulates itself into Xi Jinping's Chinese dream rhetoric domestically, but it also has an international flavor. China explicitly links the successful economic and military development with China being a global good to be encouraged and supported by other states. I think it's also worth just making a point here, I'm talking about objectives, that Chinese strategy is often characterized as being long-term, cautious, risk-averse, and seeking to avoid direct conflict. I think there is some truth in that statement. China is very consciously aware of the importance of shaping when it comes to pursuing its objectives, about not simply taking the bull by the horns, as it were. But I do think it's dangerous to overemphasize that point to the sense where we believe that Beijing would not be willing or able to act directly where necessary. I think it can and does. I think if you look domestically, you can see that the Chinese Communist Party is more than willing to take pretty drastic and direct steps to counter what it perceives as threats to its position or national security. And I see no reason why that would not be true in the international domain should the Communist Party choose or believe that to be necessary or important to do so in that case. China's relationship with the other countries in this panel is an interesting question mark to me. In many ways, China is clearly the most powerful, but is also the most detached and distant when it comes to these relationships. why isn't China more prominent and takes a more overt leadership role in these relationships? Beijing clearly sees value in the continued existence of other military, particularly military challenges to the United States specifically and to the West more broadly, which all three states here fall into that category. However, it's not clear to me that it necessarily sees value in becoming more closely aligned publicly with these actors, or with giving them and their causes overt support in some areas. It has a track record of providing economic and technological support to other members of this putative axis of upheaval, and it clearly values their continued making sure that these states remain extant and remain extant as a threat, but otherwise appears to remain content to remain in the background when it comes to activity. I would suggest that part of the explanation likely lies in Beijing's desire to avoid jeopardizing its relationships with other states. If you're too close to Russia, your relationship with Europe is going to suffer. If you get closer to Iran, your relationship with the Gulf Arab states will suffer. China values both trying to maintain some degree of positive relationship on both sides of this axis. Same for North Korea, South Korea, Japan. Another element, I think, is the understanding in Beijing that there are a few realistic alternatives for China as plausible military threats to the United States. And that may limit Beijing's ability to directly leverage its nominal power to effect when it comes to setting policy agendas. This is particularly true for Russia, I think, where there is really no realistic military power of the same size or scale that could distract a particularly large part of the United States' military power away from the Indo-Pacific over the short and medium term, and in particular also pulling away potential European military contributions to the Indo-Pacific. And I think that ties back to how China has sought to manage its relationships with all three of these individual states, one bilaterally, and when it does occur in multilateral forums like the BRICS, that it values their continued existence, but it values their continued existence put to the ends of how that supports China's calculation of the balance of Chinese-US power in the Indo-Pacific, which is where China's locum of its strategic interest still sits around Taiwan and around its regional perspective at the moment. So, to the relationship between China and the UK, I would say that China's view of the UK is going to be shaped by how the UK supports or does not support this emergence of Beijing's world order. First, again, regionally in its Asia-Pacific context or Indo-Pacific context, and then perhaps globally. China is the UK's fifth largest trading partner, sixth largest in terms of import, but fifth largest overall. Could go up as far as third if the way you play with the EU's total of its individual tops, but it's certainly top 5 at worst, which I think, as we've come up several times already, that prosperity security question for the UK it's intractable, it's difficult, it's not going to go away, and it's going to be a constant, I think, of how we think about how we deal with China in the current iteration. I would point out, I think that the reverse is somewhat true as well, maybe not quite as pressing for China, but China has its own, in its approach to the UK, has its own balancing act to do in terms of how it balances between maintaining a productive economic relationship with the UK, to continue the support China's economic growth and development, with its promotion of its security interests and maybe a more coercive attitude in some aspects. And I think you can see some of that tension play out in terms of how the UK is treated versus how it treats some other states that may be not as economically or politically important to it, and where it seeks to balance those competing objectives. I think China also, I should point out, also poses major questions for the UK in terms of security of supply. It was mentioned, I think, by General Sir Tim this morning, but its dominance in the rare earth mineral market, its dominance in emerging areas of technology like artificial intelligence, like electric vehicles, and its production and supply of finished technological products and services, vis-a-vis TikTok, as one particularly notable current example, are all potential challenges for the UK in balancing these areas of work. The collection and exploitation of data is a really core objective of Beijing, and I think that filters through into how we must think about our interaction with China economically and in terms of security and the interlinkage between the two. Beijing, I think, understands that London is not simply Washington's proxy, but it does continue, understandably, to see the UK as a close US ally and potentially a key voice in rallying support for US-led world order in Europe and internationally. And that, I think, in addition to our role in the Five Eyes intelligence community, makes us a key target, if not a top-tier target, for China's espionage and influence activities. And I think it's fair to expect that to continue at the already high pace it has set itself already. This is not just applies to government, to the military, but also to UK academia, to UK business, all of which are, from the Chinese perspective, valid targets for this activity. Finally, I think it's worth noting that its actions in Hong Kong, the Chinese diaspora in the UK, and Beijing's perception of how it treats Chinese origin citizens of other countries as being Chinese nationals, and thereby a valid tool in promoting Beijing's interests, and the tension that we've already seen created locally. I think Ken McCallum mentions it in his annual threat summary last year, the amount of work MI5 was already doing at protecting ethnic Chinese British citizens from attempted influence or coercive activities from, I think he explicitly references China in that case, but that level of activity is also another challenge for us to deal with when it comes to China, that there is an undercurrent of China's embrace of a kind of a wider concept, the Chinese nation, that will affect us there. Just finally, to wrap up on the big elephant in the room for the UK, it would be nice for us to be able to think of Russia, being able to focus on Russia first and China later. We don't have that luxury. We're going to have to deal with them both at the same time. In fact, we'll probably have to deal with all four of these states at the same time, and that's going to give us a really difficult, really hard resourcing and focus questions about how we do that and how we prioritise. For the Army in particular, what would be our ask for the Indo-Pacific, and how do we build the Army collectively in order to be able to contribute effectively Indo-Pacific while still focusing the Euro-Atlantic? I think it's also worth bearing in mind just how severe the consequences of a US-China conflict over Taiwan would be for the UK, even if there is no direct UK military involvement. The scale of loss, even in a successful fight the US might incur, would likely severely curtail the US ability to provide expeditionary power support for its traditional allies in Europe, in the Middle East, and in Asia for a period of time after the end of that conflict. Are we prepared to hold the ring alone for Europe, both during a conflict in Taiwan and after for a while? At a time when the UK economy would have taken a very severe hit from the economic disruption such a conflict would have occurred. So I think I'll leave that with that cheery thought and move us on to the rest of the panel.
Yes, you started with questions and finished with questions. They were good questions, but they were difficult ones, and we may get to those in the Q&A. Which brings us on to Iran.
Well, thank you very much. So, as part of this sort of axis of upheaval, Iran has obviously got some distinctive characteristics of its own, although it shares quite a bit also, particularly with Russia, actually. I mean, Russia is its chief ally, but you'll get a sense of where I'm coming from when I say that the Russians and the Iranians don't actually like each other. So it's not a sort of an alliance in the sense that we would like, although in many ways it's much tighter than some people had assumed. But the last year has not been a good year for Iran. It started sort of 2024 feeling a little bit more upbeat about its situation, the war in Gaza. The move in public opinion was going in some ways in its own direction. You could see that with the demonstrations that were going on around the world. Interestingly, and one of the things that's very striking about this is that Iran was probably the only country, I think one of the few countries in the world actually where they couldn't get their own population interested in Palestine, Gaza at all. So I mean that was the most, and that highlights one of the great contradictions of Iran, that it is both a disruptor, it can cause a lot of pain as we've seen potentially, but it's also in a fundamental sense actually quite weak and very vulnerable and fragile. So I tend to characterize Iran as a paranoid state, and the paranoid state has certain characteristics to it. It doesn't mean that it can't cause a certain amount of damage. It's convinced, obviously, which I'm sure many people in this room will be very pleased with, that Britain runs everything. So it will, and it shares a little bit of that with the Russians, actually, I have to say, but it genuinely believes that the British are behind almost everything that possibly can happen in the world, including manipulating the Americans, by the way, so just take that in your stride. And they obviously feel, their own sort of sense of the world in terms of, are they simply disruptive or are they looking to sort of reorder the world? I think they share with the Russians and to some extent the Chinese this view that the international order is unjust, and the international order has to be reordered in their own interests. I think this is where they sort of like separate from the Chinese and the Russians, because clearly their sort of worldview their objective is somewhat different, I think, to what Putin or the Chinese might want. There was that at the time when we were doing all the nuclear negotiations, Obama had this wonderful phrase about, the arc, well, as he borrowed from Martin Luther King, I think, the arc of justice bends towards, the arc of history bends towards justice. And it's long and it bends towards justice. And I said, well, the thing is that the Iranian leadership has the same view. It's just that the destination is different. So, I mean, you have to sort of bear that in mind. They have their own internal logic. They have the sort of rationality they want, but their view about what the world will look like at the end of this is somewhat different. And you can see that, their pursuit in that in terms of what they've been doing really in sort of supporting the war against Israel, which has gone very badly for it, obviously, in military terms and material terms over the last year, but also really in doubling down with Russia. I mean, I think the doubling down with Russia in 2022 was probably the most significant strategic step they took. It sort of overturns about 2 centuries of Iranian foreign policy, I have to say, to get into bed with Russia quite so deeply. The supply of drones, the supply possibly of missiles and others to the Russians, but actually, this sort of doubling down with the Russians. And I have to say, I mean, one of the striking things has been that some of the Russian rhetoric has reflected, I have to say, this sort of symbiotic relation that's emerged, particularly if you look at the words of Medvedev and others. I mean, I always used to think that Russia was the adult in the room in the relationship, but I sort of began to worry, I think, about the last 2 years. They're both quite apocalyptic in their messaging. But still, there's no real love lost between them in that respect. So I think if you look at the last year has been bad for the Iranians. I mean, it's not been good. They wanted, their way of warfare, in a sense, is to cheer from the sidelines, to give the proxies the support they need, get them to get going. The proxies got a bit fed up with this strategy eventually. The Israelis were obviously provoking as far as they possibly could, managed to get the Iranians to stick their heads above the parapet with the various missile launches, but have then since, if we looked at it in not only Gaza, obviously, but mainly the decapitation, effectively, of Hezbollah, the whole business with the pagers, which we then discovered were sourced in Iran, which is great. I mean, they obviously purchased them online or something or other. Had the supply routes sort of like penetrated. But then also the collapse of Syria. I mean, Syria is a huge loss for Iran. And the Iranians have admitted it, by the way. I mean, if you ever want to, it's not difficult to find information on Iran because they talk a lot and they talk online, and there are lots of things are leaked. And there was a Revolutionary Guard commander recently came up and he sort of said, this is a fiasco for us. Don't let anyone believe that Syria is nothing. It is a fiasco for us. But here's the thing. It's also that they laid into the Russians big time. They basically said that when the Israelis were flying over to attack us, the Russians turned off the radar in Syria so that they could do it. I mean, and it's quite clear also that the assassination of various IRGC generals in Syria was probably done with the Russians either turning a blind eye or sending information or whatever. It comes to the fact that the Russians don't really want the Iranians in Syria anyway, neither did the Syrians, as it happened, actually. But, and you can see the reaction there. So it is a blow for them. I mean, it has been a blow, and we should see it. And what they're trying to do now, if you look at it, is launch some sort of charm offensive vis-a-vis the Trump administration. I mean, I have to say, if you look at the former Foreign Minister Zarif sitting in Davos, very eloquent American English, don't believe a word he says, by the way, but he's very good at it. He even said, I kid you not, that with Trump's withdrawal from the JCPOA in 2018 wasn't his fault, which I thought was very generous of them. It was obviously imposed on him by various, John Bolton, whoever it was. I mean, again, it's a complete rewriting of history. They're trying in some ways to reach out. We don't know what will happen with the Trump administration, to be honest. He's appointed a whole range of individuals with different opinions on Iran. But I have to say, I don't know what the impact of this will be on Iran itself, because Iran's position domestically is extremely fragile. And I want to sort of just wrap up really a little bit with this, because I think it's something that we don't look at enough. We look at Iran really from an international relations perspective, from its relationships and how it causes problems, and it certainly does. And by the way, one of the disruptive elements it has here, I think, was sort of we were talking a little bit, it was mentioned a bit earlier, is really in the elements of soft power. And we allow the Iranians access to British civil society, if I can put it that way, a little bit too willingly. A little bit, we sort of say, well, we're not willing to sort of clamp down on some of the things that they do. But more interestingly, I think, is what's going on domestically. And domestically, their situation is not good. As I already sort of alluded to the fact that they couldn't get people out in support of Gaza or the Palestinians. People are just not interested. I think the maximum size of the crowd they were able to pull out at one stage was about 3,000. Now, why is that? One is that they don't want to bring crowds out onto the street because they're worried about what the crowds may do. Okay. The second point is that simply people weren't obviously as interested as they thought they might be in supporting the Palestinians. There have been 3 or 4 major cycles of demonstrations and protests in Iran from 2017 onwards, very violently put down. The last one was probably not as violently put down as the previous ones, but it was still traumatic, and probably the one in which society, in effect, in some ways, is effectively broken with the state. So that was the Women, Life, Freedom ones that were done in 2022. And now what you're seeing is not only a wider sort of social state-society gulf in Iran, but also a sort of a material breakdown of their infrastructure. So, we have problems with infrastructure and investment. I know we all have it, but the Iranians are on a qualitatively different basis. And the basic problem Iran has is it inherited a fairly powerful state in the revolution from the Pahlavi monarchy. It was fairly wealthy, it was fairly well equipped, whatever. It has never really, in the past 44 years, actually done anything to reinvest in that material infrastructure, or even, in my view, the political and social infrastructure that would come. So that political, social, economic capital has been draining over the last 44 years. And it's now getting to a stage where it's sort of running out. So just think about this for a moment. We're talking about resources. I mean, Iran sits on the second largest natural gas reserves in the world, largely unexploited, it has to be said, because nobody can invest in there, or they won't. 4th largest oil reserves in the world, and yet it's running out of energy. Now, it's running out of energy because it just simply doesn't have the infrastructure to maintain or sustain a tripling of its sort of population over the last 44 years. So it's now got a population of about 90 million. Its energy infrastructure was actually built in the 70s for a population of about 38, 40 million. Okay? It's running out of water. About 50 of the cities in Iran are suffering from serious subsidence because it's drained its water resources so badly over that, and also planned its sort of water infrastructure incompetently that large parts of the country are actually just running out of water. And it's basically told people that they can't heat their homes or can't sort of light their houses. There are power cuts going through in major cities in Iran now, about 2-3 hours a day. I mean, think about it. And the reason why this is a much more serious problem is because, in the aftermath of the revolution, there were problems. We had the Iran-Iraq war, of course, whatever. But people sort of expected that things would get better. And actually, they haven't. I mean, they've got much, much worse. So this problem within the sort of body politic is one that is going to haunt the Iranians. And whatever happens, actually, with Trump, and, who knows, let's say, for the sake of argument, Trump decides he's going to fly to Tehran for one reason or another. I mean, actually, that, I think, would be the kiss of death for the regime, so I hope he does it. But, I mean, in a sense, Iran's problems, is what I'm trying to say, are so fundamental, so structural, that it's going to be very difficult for them to resolve them simply by kissing and making up with the West, let's say. It's just not going to happen in that sense. I mean, it needs to take some really fundamental decisions at home. Now, what does it mean for us in the short term, let's say? It could mean, of course, that they might hit out. I mean, one of the things is that if we're going to go down, let's go down with a flourish. And so they might try and do something. But I think that, they're really torn about what they can and cannot do. They're looking now really for the Europeans, but particularly the Americans, to perhaps give them a sort of some sort of way out. But in order to do that, they're going to have to break with Russia. There's no doubt in my mind. They're going to have to do something about the Middle East, which is less than death to Israel, on a daily basis, and death to everyone else. They're going to have to change things. In sum, they're going to have to stop being a revolutionary power. And I don't think they've come to that conclusion yet. I just don't think they've come to that conclusion yet. They're going to run with this for a bit longer. And, the truth of the matter is, the longer they run with it, the more difficult it is for them to get out of it, and the more difficult the problems will be. So the prognosis for Iran in the medium term is, certainly for me, is what you're going to be facing is what I would call a failing state. And that will have repercussions for everyone, by the way. And you need to think about that in the region and otherwise, that what's going to happen. I don't think that the state is going to collapse or anything like that. We're not in a Venezuela situation. But the fact is that that level of control that it tried to maintain over its proxies is going to start fracturing. It just won't be able to pay them anymore, right? And so that is going to have consequences for the region as a whole. And then we have to see what the Israelis and others might do. But those are the things that I think, when we're looking at Iran, it's certainly not as rational and pragmatic as the Chinese. It hasn't got sort of certain, I don't think it's as bold in some ways as the Russians. It sort of sits somewhere between the Russians and the Chinese. I don't know what the North Koreans are up to be honest. But it is an odd example. It's an odd case. And I'm certainly not one of those, as you will hear, that Iran is a sort of a rising power. It isn't. It just isn't. And you just have to look internally to see what's going on. It's a mess, actually, internally. So I think in the medium term, how we deal with Iran is going to be, in some ways, complicated by that fact. And we have to think in slightly more creative ways about it. There's no state in that sense that is, in complete control of its area. So we need to think. And by the way, I will say there are opportunities for Britain in that. If the ladies and gentlemen at the Foreign Office will take that opportunity, they may find themselves, with something more beneficial at the end of that road. But it's a question in the West of us being, I dare say, strategic and coherent. And I know that's a big ask. But it's one of the things that I hope that we do.
No, thank you. No pressure at all there. And a nice segue as well. I'm not sure many people know what's going on in North Korea. So fortunately, we've got a subject matter expert in the room to tell us.
So North Korea has been described by a colleague of mine as uniquely unique. That description violates all of the laws of English grammar, but actually it's true. The historical context of the formation of North Korea is very resonant and still is resonant to the state in the present day, particularly the division of the Korean Peninsula. But also, in contrast to Iran seeing Britain as the source of all of the ills, North Korea sees the US as basically a hostile power. And as the North Koreans said long before Trump was elected last November, we don't care who wins the US election. Our view on the United States as a hostile power, pursuing a hostile policy with its allies to try and overthrow the Kim regime, will never change. I'd like to borrow from a term from Maoist China, which you might think slightly unusual, the Gang of Four. We've got a Gang of Four here: China, Russia, Iran and North Korea. Different individual interests, and I think that's very important to bear in mind. Convergent in some areas, perhaps divergent in others. But there is a shared goal, which is an opposition to the US-led liberal international order and an intention to overturn these rules that underline this order. Or is it? Take China and Russia. Take the position of the UN Security Council at the moment. The United Nations Security Council is at its most impotent since 1945, in my view. If Kim Jong-un wanted to test a seventh nuclear device, he should do it tomorrow, because the Security Council could neither issue a statement of condemnation, lack of consensus, nor impose sanctions. As an international relations scholar, John Mearsheimer, once said, sanctions, forget about it. But in China and Russia's worldview, actually it's in their own interest not to overthrow the UN Security Council. North Korea would be perfectly happy to see the UN Security Council burned and dead. It could do whatever it wants. But for China and Russia, maintaining their veto power is crucial, maintaining the status quo is crucial, and now they've offered North Korea their unwavering support. At least Russia has. To try and unpack a little bit about what's going on at the moment in terms of the relationship between Pyongyang and these other states, I think the Russian defense minister can help a little bit. He made a surprise visit to Pyongyang last November. I think whether it was a surprise or not, that's debatable. But he said, referring to the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership Treaty, which was a treaty signed between Putin and Kim Jong-un on the 19th of June last year, which contained a mutual defence pact. The Defence Minister Belousov said that this treaty will play a stabilising role in Northeast Asia, number one, contribute positively to maintaining balance of power in the region, number two, reduce the risk of war on the Korean Peninsula, thirdly, and finally, to me, which was most striking, lay the groundwork for a new Eurasian security system. So what is this new Eurasian security system? Well, if you're Kim Jong-un, you would say that this is excellent news. It's a timely measure, he said, to inform the US, the West, and the Ukraine, which for North Korea is all in one homogeneous bloc, of the gravity of the situation caused by the West, caused by the United States. I fundamentally believe that because now we're at the stage where Pyongyang is a full-fledged participant in Russia's war, with a full-fledged nuclear weapons program, and the term full-fledged is that emanating from Pyongyang, not me. This transactional relationship, which was fundamentally premised around a cash for artillery exchange, is now something more. The transaction is still there, but it's become strategic and it's become ideological. I've mentioned the impotence of the impotency of the UN Security Council, both a win for Russia but also for North Korea. But it's also a win for North Korea because denuclearization is off the table. It's not even on the table. North Korea has not been pretending to engage in talks with the West for the last 4 years, and it doesn't intend to anytime soon. Instead, Pyongyang seeks to accelerate the scope and sophistication of its nuclear weapons and delivery systems. We've seen this in recent weeks, haven't we? We've seen solid fuel technology and hypersonic ballistic missiles being tested, harder to detect, easier to maneuver, a clear challenge to the defence of the Indo-Pacific, which the UK forms an integral part. If you're Japan, you're obviously going to be very irritated. It's not normal state behaviour to see missiles crashing down into your exclusive economic zone. But what's perhaps more concerning for us is that these missiles are flying faster, further, and staying in the air for longer. Ever since the 24th of February 2022, we've seen what's gone from a rhetorical relationship, North Korea being one of states, only a few states, including Syria, Eritrea, Russia, and Belarus, in voting against the UN General Assembly resolution condemning Russia's invasion. And I say vote against, not abstain, to actually supplying quantities and qualitative goods. Now, we can debate for hours on end about whether North Korean 122, 152 millimeter artillery shells are numerous, are qualitatively good. Perhaps, as a quotation that's often misattributed to Stalin makes clear, quantity has a quality all of its own. We've seen ballistic missiles being sent, and now, perhaps most concerningly, over 11,000 North Korean troops being deployed initially to the Kursk region. And there's growing evidence, including from Ukrainian intelligence reports yesterday, about the treatment of North Korean soldiers who have been captured. I don't think we need to be clear mathematicians to realise that troops will eventually run out. 11,000 North Korean soldiers, most of whom have been sent from the North Korean elite, and I use that word quite clearly, the North Korean elite, the Storm Corps Special Forces, these numbered around about 60,000. And let's just consider last year the high daily attrition rate of Russian troops. The fact that North Korean troops have been killed, and these reports are in the public domain, is anything perhaps but surprising. For all their loyalty towards the Kim regime, these troops quickly become little but cannon fodder for Putin. I'd like to conclude briefly by talking about rational behaviour. North Korea may be unpredictable, but it's not irrational. Its behaviour is what I call of a strategic delinquent. It behaves badly and it gets rewards. By engaging with Moscow, it has been able to get food, financial assistance, oil, and now the prospect of military and missile technology. We don't know much about the latter, but we sure know that Kim Jong-un wants it. And this is why it should feature in the UK's considerations of defence in the Indo-Pacific. Why? Because it's not just that South Korea is our strong partner. We have diplomatic relations with North Korea too. If any of you are from Acton, there's a North Korean embassy there. I just wouldn't recommend that you go in. I don't think you'd be allowed in. To conclude, even if the Ukraine war were to end tomorrow, I am very clear, and I think that even if Russia no longer needs ballistic missiles or troops, the relationship will continue, even though it won't be the same. And I think to ignore that would be naive. The final article of the Comprehensive Partnership Treaty says that the treaty will last indefinitely. What then of Trump? Before I even get there, I think it's worth saying, Russia refers to this relationship as a partnership. North Korea calls it an alliance. Just to finish, when we talk about the Trump administration, will Kim Jong-un meet Trump once again? Perhaps. Who knows? Marco Rubio has a very strong and, in my view, quite an admirable policy on China. Does that show that actually the US administration is more focused on China than it is on North Korea. That will affect the state of play. Kim Jong-un could quite happily say, I've got Russia. Why do I need the US? Kim Jong-un does not want the humiliation of the Hanoi summit when the two leaders didn't even have lunch. They left, and there was no tangible benefit for the North Korean leader. North Korea today in 2024 is not the same as in 2017. It's not just that the menu of options may have shrunk a little bit, the price of each item has increased markedly. This is Trump 2.0, but it's also Kim 3.0. And if there's one message I have on the part of UK defence, it's that it's time to take the North Korean threat seriously, to work with allies and partners, to avoid appeasing adversaries, and to make this world, and to avoid making this world safe for autocracies. I'll end there.
So we've had a brilliant series of commentaries there, and what actually is, as I'm sure you'll agree and has been brought out, it's a highly nuanced theme to discuss. It's not as straightforward as it may or may not appear at the beginning. And we've got about 30 minutes for questions, which is great, because I'm sure there'll be plenty of them. As my director did, I will also take the same, and I'll have the first one, because I've got a whole page of them, but I promise only one. I mean, I note from your comments there, and also from what we heard in the previous panel, there's no sort of founding document here. There's no Washington Treaty or UN Charter, and I think a couple of you talked about a club. There's no clubhouse. There's no rule book. So is there room for new members? Or, how do they join? Is it a franchise approach, for example? Is it sort of, quite happy to, you don't have to be in the club, you can go off and do something. But the one that would really, and touched on it a little bit, is there a hierarchy of upheaval? Who leads, who follows? Or is it just not that kind of a club? So there we go, I'll drop that in.
There is room for new members. I think the membership is weirdly somewhat defined by us externally, identifying people as adversaries, as opposed to states choosing to coalesce around this ideal. And I think it touched upon the question mark whether they share a common goal. Like, if you just define it as revising or resisting the existing US-led world order, yes, but they all have different views about what the revised world order should look like. So common cause, yes, but common goal maybe not, and that maybe explains why this is a group defined by us externally in some ways, as opposed to one that they have a cohesive manifesto. I think a lot of the lack of formal hierarchy in sets plays down to the by far the strongest power is not interested in working like that, doesn't think of alliances as being the utility of alliances to China are not perceived in the same way we would view the utility of alliances to the UK or to the United States. One American academic who I've discussed this with suggested that maybe from China's perspective, we've got all the good allies already. What's left on the table is not worth formally allying with. You use them in different ways. I guess the question mark then is kind of when it comes to the relationship between the military sort of interaction between these states in terms of technology transfer versus the economic interactions that do go into wider areas, already have kind of BRICS, currency conversion alliances, and those kind of things, that may also include states that are more clearly in what we would call the non-aligned camp from earlier, and where that distinction lies between what groups these states, these particular gang of four together, versus what defines them separately.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I think really the only thing that unites them at the moment is pushing back against US dominance, is my sense. And I also think there's a lot of signalling that goes on. I think it's, the signing of the agreements with both North Korea and Iran. I think a lot of this was about external audiences and saying, look, we've got friends and we can scare you with these partnerships. Although it was interesting that the Russian-Iranian treaty, there's no mutual defence clause in there, is there? Only with North Korea. And I thought that was very, very interesting. My sense is they're all marriages of convenience. They're very, very useful in the current climate, but there are many reasons why each of these relationships could well, fall apart and fall away. There's no uniting thread. In terms of a hierarchy, obviously. I think we would agree that China is the leader, the big boss, and I mean, from a Russian perspective, Russia is clearly the junior partner in the Russia-Chinese kind of partnership.
I'm not sure whether Russia necessarily knows that, but
well, no, I think they do. I think they're quite nervous of their very, very populous neighbour. I think they are nervous. They have a long history.
they would be wise to remember their history.
I think the fact there's no founding document outlining who's in this club, what are the criteria to get in this club, actually makes things more concerning from the perspective of the West, from the perspective of the UK, from the perspective of the US, particularly because there are, I think it's incorrect to say that all 4 of these states are identical. But they all do talk about an alternative global order. It's just what they mean by that. There may be a lot of variation from within. We can say that this sort of group of gang of 4, to go back to my earlier designation, has been defined by us externally, a little bit like the axis of upheaval, George W. Bush's axis of evil. But these 4 states were certainly not well behaved before that. Yeah. Joe Nye called Russia a spoiler. I think we're going past that now. It's not just a spoiler, there's something more here. Just 2 things. The first is that everyone thought China would be angry when Russia and North Korea signed this partnership treaty. Why? Some people, I'll say that again, some people thought that China would be angry. Because since 1996, when the Soviet-North Korea treaty expired, and that didn't make the North Koreans very happy. They absolutely hated Yeltsin. The China-North Korea treaty signed in 1961 was the only treaty that either country had with another state. Come June 2019, China still has this treaty with North Korea, and now North Korea has one with China and with Russia. This does place China in a bit of a dilemma, because if it follows the treaty, there is a clause that says it has to assist North Korea if there is a threat of attack. And I think this is why we've seen China actually be quite uneasy and ambivalent. Newspaper articles have interviewed loads of Chinese scholars, all of whom say variations on the theme, which is, oh yes, China could do something if it wanted to, but we're just concerned about our borders. And so I think China is uncomfortable, but it doesn't want to announce publicly what it thinks about the North Korea-Russia relationship. Not least because North Korea and Russia now, at least, neither Pyongyang nor Moscow have admitted the presence of North Korean troops.
The advantage of coming last. I have to say, I agree with almost all that was said there. I think a lot of these agreements are very visual. They're very they're performances intended to impress us, and to some extent the fourth estate. I think some journalists get a bit overexcited about it. When the BRICS was all sorted out, everyone thought, oh my God, this is going to be an alternative economic model. It isn't really when you've got Venezuela and Iran involved. When North Korea and Iran, I think, are the 2 blacklisted in the FATF. So it's not an economic, powerhouse in that sense. And the idea that there's going to be a new reserve currency anytime soon, I think, is really wishful thinking, actually, for many people. That said, it does not mean that we should be complacent. This is the other thing. This is where I think the danger is. There is a sort of, I think, a pushback. But the regime itself is is against any sort of Western focus. But there is this feeling that if only we'd be nice to them, and if only we paid them a bit more attention and massaged their egos a bit, they'd all love to come back into the fold. And of course, for Iranians in general, this is exactly what they'd like to do. I don't think you can do it with the current regime, I have to say, but because it would be a sort of a contradiction too far for them. But nonetheless, you do get this sense, I think, with all the South Africas, the other, all these other, they sort of resent what the West did. They resent it, and therefore they want to push back. And it's more these agreements they have with each other are more push against the West than pull together. They don't actually like the Russians. They don't like this. But they sort of move because they think it'll irritate the Americans. Whether Trump, I have to say, is the solution to that or not is I think a moot question. It all depends. I think what these powers and what these people would like to see is a little bit of clarity from the West. And to some extent, you will get clarity from Trump, I think, but maybe not the right sort of clarity is what I'm saying. So, I mean, one has to be a little bit careful about how you push the, if you get too bombastic. We have advantages. We don't actually play them very well, to be honest. And I think, people, because they resent the West, they go and do this sort of stuff. But all these agreements, and I'm very struck by this non-defense, because I can say the Iranians are not happy with the Russians. But there was a similar agreement with the Chinese. They said about 4 years ago, I had to go and translate this document at one stage, which was that they'd signed a strategic partnership with the Chinese. And of course, I mean, all this was just hot air. When you looked at it, the Chinese said, we'll sign this with Iran. And they said $400 billion worth of investment. And I was told recently that the grand total of Chinese investment, in inverted commas, in Iran over the last 5 years is 114 million. I mean, it's nothing. And of course it's nothing, because even the Chinese aren't stupid enough to invest in Iran. I mean, it's not, why would you do that? I mean, there's nothing to be gained. What they're interested in, I think, is Saudi Arabia more than anything else, aren't they, really? I mean, that's where they're getting most of their oil from. Is that right or not?
This is the interesting balance is, on the economic front, the Gulf states have far more to offer China than Iran does. But the Gulf states do not pose a security threat to the United States' interest in the Middle East that would keep the US military there. There is a reason that 1/5 to 1/4 of the US's disposable IAMD capability is tied up in the Middle East, and where Beijing is playing that balance between its long-term economic interest with how it's creating its security advantage for its Taiwan question with the United States, I think kind of colours how it deals with how it has to keep Iran propped up to keep that threat there. And that's going to make it more difficult to balance its overall interest in the region.
I'm going to go to the floor because I can feel excitement in the room. So we've got a good chunk of time, and I'm sure there actually are a good chunk of questions to come. You may have to wave at me because I've got one eye down at the moment, and that's fine. I'm happy to accept waves. I can see a wave already, and I can see another one. It's very good. If the question is aimed at a specific panellist, please could you say so? If not, we'll assume it's general, and I'll just sort of...
Cool. Thanks very much, Major Queen Reeves. I was just wondering, or hoping for the panel's view on the axis of upheaval and what the dynamics between different countries might look in a post-Putin era.
Well, not too hard to begin with. I think over to you, Tracey, on that one.
I think I'll leave that.
Really?
No, I don't. Anybody want to go first?
What I would say is I don't think we're going to see too much change in Russian foreign policy if and when, and it's a huge if, Putin kind of exits stage left in whatever fashion he leaves. There's so much unknown at the moment with regards to what we're going to see in terms of any kind of ceasefire in Ukraine with Trump coming in. Now, obviously, he promised to solve it day one. Then someone told me it might be a bit more complicated than that. 100 days I saw recently. Obviously, what the Kremlin would like, one of their key demands is the lifting of the sanctions regime. Now, if that happened, whether Putin is there or not, it'd be very interesting to see their relationships with these, this gang here. Obviously, China, I think, China's long been, an important partner, but whether the relationship continues as strongly as it has with North Korea and Iran, once and if sanctions are lifted, I think it's a very big question. But this kind of hostility, I think, to Western dominance, US dominance, which is what's united these, rather than any positive, what we'd like to see in future, is going to continue, I would suggest, in Moscow. I just don't see, even once we, post-Putin, a dramatic change.
Brilliant.
There's a lot of anger.
You get a buyout on the next one for going first. Thank you.
Very quickly, I would agree. I think that the most likely outcome of mentioned it before, it's not, Putin has his ideology and his views, but they are shaped by a wider Russian worldview. I think that the most likely outcome of the post-Putin Russia would be very similar international politics, but it's interesting how worried the Chinese are that might not be the case. There's lots of questions that came out, Chinese visits in the last couple of years. They know that Russia had a rapprochement with the West at the end of the Cold War, and they want to know what happened then and whether it might happen again, because a Russia-West rapprochement is really problematic for the Chinese because they have no logical replacement. And even if we think it might be unlikely, the Chinese have spent a fair bit of time worried about what might be the case, even if it's low probability.
If we just look back historically, at the end of the Cold War, the North Koreans really were not on good terms with Russia. The North Koreans could not stand Gorbachev. They called him a traitor. They said he was a destroyer of socialism. This is Kim Jong-il. And the North Koreans absolutely hated Yeltsin because Yeltsin from the get-go said, well, actually, why bother honouring this Soviet North Korea 1961 treaty? Mutual assistance, utter waste of time, utter waste of money. Trade will now be conducted not on friendship prices, but back to market rates. And the North Koreans had very little time for him. Putin comes in, though, and when Putin first becomes prime minister, then obviously becomes president in 2000, I think in May 2000, or in April or May that year, it only takes 2 months for Putin and Kim Jong-il to meet. They sign another treaty with no mutual defence clause, but we see trade experiencing an uptick. We see Kim Jong-il, a man who absolutely hated travelling, visiting Moscow several times. And we see something crucial happen in 2012, when Putin says that Russia would pay off 90% of North Korea's Soviet-era debt. That amounted to around about $11 billion. Right? What would happen to the 10%? The 10% North Korea would invest in a Russian account in a North Korean bank, and Russia would try and use that money to fund infrastructure projects like railways that would go from the Russian Far East through North Korea into South Korea. The railway's never been constructed, but that's neither here nor there for the North, is it? Right? I think in a post-Putin era, North Korea's worldview towards the US will remain the same. Even if sanctions are eased, if there's partial easing of sanctions, North Korea and Russia will be able to unite on that front. All of the discourse we're seeing coming from Pyongyang says, look, it's not just Russia that was right to invade Ukraine because of the US, and it was the US that was the root cause of the Ukraine war. Actually, this is a country which, like us, which, like Iran, is being stifled by sanctions. So long as there's some element of sanctions remaining, even in the post-Putin era, I think the North Korean relationship with Russia will still be there. It just won't be what it is now. I think it's really important we make it clear that actually, even in a post-Ukraine world, the relationship will not be like it is now, but that doesn't mean to say it will just disappear.
Are you happy to?
I mean, assuming that the general political dynamics in each country are the same. I mean, I don't think there will be much change. You know, the Iranians are quite dependent on the Russians on a number of different points. I have to say, though, that clearly all these things are joined up. If the Russians suffer a defeat in Ukraine, it will rebound very heavily in Iran. I mean, don't underestimate that. I mean, and the trouble is, we tend to view these things as very sort of discrete and separate. But as we saw in Syria, I mean, there's a reason why Syria collapsed so quickly, in part, not entirely, but in part. And partly it's because the Iranians and the Russians were just not there. I mean, they couldn't do anything.
Question there. Yeah, just behind you. Sorry. But then to you. But then to you next. He waved at me first, and I
Without wanting to impose on the panel too much Stockholm syndrome of representing the views of the countries you'd be talking about. We have a repeating theme that it's not just here, it's around the place, that these are countries unified by a view that the current Western-driven world order is wrong. We seem to always assume that world view is wrong. I wonder if we could ask each of the panel to sort of succumb to Stockholm syndrome for a moment. Is there a way in which actually they're right for these countries and the international world order is behaving badly, or are they just people, we cannot deal with it. We have to accept that realism is going to be the way forward for England in the future.
So, even with my eye, I can see lots of waving, and time is already... So, 60 seconds, each panel member. Who wants to go first?
I'll take it again. I mean, I think if you want to argue, could the international world order be better, be fairer? Sure, but there's always going to be challenges like that. It's never going to work that way. I'm not sure there's a panacea that says you're going to get something suitable for China's concept that keeps the Communist Party secure in the control they want in the areas they want it in. That is essentially a kind of a good bargain for the rest of the world to take at that point. I think China is perhaps closest of these four to being more interested in parts of the existing world order. It doesn't want to blow it all up. It wants to revise bits of it, but the bits it wants to revise and how it wants to revise them would have fairly drastic repercussions. I think would be very difficult to accept on anything but a force majeure question. China would have to impose it.
So very briefly, a lot of the Russian position is driven by deep anger and resentment at what happened in the 90s in Russia, and then Western hypocrisy, their behaviour. This sense of you tell everybody to obey the international rules-based system and international law, but then look at what you do. Look at the way you behave. Regime change, and they point. Afghanistan, Iraq, non-intervention in Libya. In Syria, and obviously intervention in Libya. And so, I can see where some of their anger and comes from, and, some of what they say, the points of this hypocrisy, point taken. But, international law, the rules-based international order is there, for a reason, and it functions, what is the alternative, quite frankly? None of these four states are really proposing an alternative, just saying, we don't like this.
North Korea is obviously aligned with Russia and parts in China and with Iran in terms of trying to expose the hypocrisy of the US-led liberal international order. North Korea fundamentally views the whole division of the Korean Peninsula, firstly along the 38th parallel, as an act of hypocrisy. Right? The US invasion of Iraq, 2003, great ammunition for North Korea to try and get nuclear weapons. Right? After Iraq, after Saddam Hussein fell, the logic of getting a nuclear bomb was irrefutable for the North. But I think for North Korea, if North Korea wanted to be part of this international order, or part of the majority international order, it would have to do something which it's not willing to do, which is economic reform and political reform. In 2018, according to the then South Korean president, and that's a whole other, South Korea is a whole other issue. Apparently Kim Jong-un was willing to join the IMF and the World Bank. He wanted to. He thought that would help North Korea, but he wasn't willing to do his bit.
I think, yes, it's very easy to talk about, I think it's been said, the notion of Western hypocrisy. I think the Iranians have a model, but it's not pretty. Yeah. So, the thing is as you say, the alternative is just, they don't have a sensible alternative that the rest of the world is going to sign up to. Yeah. And that's, I think, the major problem. But yeah, you can see that there's a lot of complaints about Western hypocrisy, of course, and it goes back to what I was saying earlier about, having a strategic worldview and a coherent one. We tend to jump and change and whatever, and of course that irritates, but of course it does.
Yeah, thank you. Yep.
Historically, some of America's most hawkish presidents have actually had the most dovish outcomes. So there's a potential, I think, with Trump for the same. Do you believe, I suppose primarily a China-focused question, but do you believe that this grouping, China particularly, will not want to take an obvious leadership role and allow Trump to, on the one hand, approach the strongman admiration, bromance, flattery, alongside hard-nosed threats, to almost divide off the other three nations before he can focus on China?
I think there's a question like, is Trump a hawkish administration or not, or is Trump a Trump administration that has such a personal touch is difficult. His individual staffers may have or his individual cabinet. I think China will be caught between there's a lot of opportunity to the way Trump does business in terms of breaking or undermining traditional US alliances and support, and for that, in that sense, China would like to position itself to exploit that, but also the risk of whether it's Trump or whether it is just the individual behaviours of its, what do they call them, gang? Not even China's gang, but it's we would call them the partners part of allies and partners, leading them into areas where they are undermining their value to China because they're reducing their military capability in Russia's sense in the long term, or they are, in terms of that, they are putting themselves in a position where they are going to have to seek potentially rapprochements or might be interested in a deal Trump has on the table. And I think that will concern Beijing in the sense of, I mean, Trump as a deal maker has its ups and its downs, but Beijing has a genuine view of like what happens to us if Russia either under Putin or post-Putin strikes a deal with a Trump administration or a subsequent US administration that takes them out of this axis of upheaval directly. I mean, what do we do? What do we do then in terms of the balance vis-a-vis the US? I think that the uncertainty about where Trump 2.0 takes the United States and how much opportunity it offers China versus how much challenge it offers China is something that probably occupies a lot of people in Beijing right now.
I think we've got to distinguish between Trump and the US policy. I mean, even the North Koreans distinguished this before the November election when they said in the first Trump administration, yes, Kim Jong-un and Trump wrote love letters to each other. That was excellent. But relations between the states plummeted to a nadir. And I think that's an extremely important point. Will China want to take a leadership role? If I just talk about the North Korea, Russia, China, what some have called a strategic triangle. I'm sorry, that overlooked. The quadrilateral is out, right? I mean, one thing could be, you could say that actually if China just wanted to step in and wanted to decouple North Korea from Russia so that it could have better relations with the US or with Japan and with South Korea, China should stop trading in dual-use technologies with Russia. China should stop abetting and helping North Korea evade UN sanctions, which ironically in 2017 China supported.
I can take one more, possibly two, certainly one.
WO2 Irish Guards, Matthew Roberts. Question with Donald Trump. He did state if there was a ceasefire, there's an 800-mile buffer zone that needs to be obviously manned by European forces. If, for example, depending on what President Zelensky said, he said there should be, a minimum of 200,000 that should patrol that border. If that was NATO, that is obviously trying to give security, what would that look like in terms of these pacts and treaties with North Korea probably merging to show significance and influence? And also, would Iran probably jump on the bandwagon along the side?
There you go.
I was thinking if there's 200,000, presumably the only people who could do that are the Turks.
Which would also be...
Which would be quite interesting, wouldn't it? I mean, get the Turks back into Crimea.
If interesting is the right word. Well, could be the final question, full panel sweep, 60 seconds. I was asked a version of this question, by the way, earlier in the week. It didn't go very well for me, so...
Would the North Koreans get involved? They might get involved. I mean, if I mean, I think all of this depends on how far Kim Jong-un is willing to go, right? By sending 11,000 troops at least to the Kursk region initially, Kim Jong-un has shown that North Korea is not an observer to Ukraine, that it's a full-fledged participant. Okay, we've got to a stage now where we either have a Euro-Atlantic and an Indo-Pacific, two separate theatres merging, or we have one global theatre split into two. Right? The question would be, and I can't answer this question, I just don't know. What are North Korea's red lines with respect to the costs of doing so? We've seen a lot of evidence emerge about the treatment of North Korean soldiers by the Russians. They've been captured, 2 or 3, more than that, have now been captured by Ukraine. It's a very unsatisfactory answer. I think we'll have to wait and see. But we can't rule out North Korean involvement if it knows what it's getting back in return. Whether that's decoys, whether that's satellite technology, whether that's cameras, all of what Kim Jong-un wants.
Is this going to be China sort of drawing on some of its DPKO expertise?
Well, China likes to talk about its peace building capacity. Its actual practical commitment to doing so, especially to enforcing them afterwards, is very limited.
There's always a first time.
I think there is a line here that says China looks at NATO committing 200,000 of its personnel to a long-term, maybe indefinite commitment to a security buffer there. Good. That's 200,000 people extra who aren't available for something else. That's resourcing for that. It's not going to be turned to account somewhere else. I think the best you would see from the Chinese a notional kind of involvement to commitment there. But I think anything that smacks of China would have it having to take action if there is a breach of that ceasefire. No, that is not a position Beijing wants to put itself into, because it's. I mean, what happened? Either Ukraine or Russia is in the wrong, and it's going to put itself either up against NATO or up against Russia very quickly if it takes a stance there. It would much rather leave that to everyone else, make that someone else's problem, and get to focus on what it wants to do.
So, I mean, what I would say is look at the history of some of the conflicts in the post-Soviet space where Russia's been involved, and we've then had international kind of peacekeeping, stabilization. In Georgia, in particular, we had a UN mission in Abkhazia, we had an OSCE mission, monitoring mission in South Ossetia, and Russian peacekeepers were involved, along with many internationals. The Georgian President Saakashvili termed them peacekeepers, as in pieces of territory rather than keeping any form of peace. So I think there's some big questions about the content of any kind of mission, kind of peacekeeping, peace enforcement that would go, and who would be there. I'm sure the Ukrainians would not be happy if there were North Koreans, for example, because as you said, that they're participants in the conflict. So, yeah.
A final.
And what if, say, on the part of North Korea, what if the South Koreans decide actually to get involved and say, look, we've had experience of war, we have experience of post-war reconstruction, we're going to get involved now, after any ceasefire. What would the North Koreans do?
The Korean War fought in Eastern Europe, we'll end there probably. So, I've heard, I mean, going back to the kind of so what for Britain. Interestingly, some opportunity. Not entirely a negative picture, not entirely. I've also heard some sort of potential of guilt by association and other misdemeanours, and it lurked a little bit, maybe didn't come quite as much to the fore as at the beginning, but as we sort of go into Trump 47, when madman meets rational/irrational actor, what happens? Is it irresistible force meets immovable object or something worse? And what does it mean for us on the sort of, we're caught in what's going on, embracing could be the madness. I don't know. I just want to thank you. You're the best panel I've ever moderated because your timekeeping was impeccable, brilliant, but also the way in which you did it. Lots and lots of answers for us. Actually also quite a lot of questions as well still to go at. So thank you very much.
One is to attempt to replace Shashank and give what he would have given, which was a really erudite, clever worldview, pulling out nuance and filling you with as many questions as answers, although I hope I will leave you with some questions. Nor am I going to attempt to summarise the discussion that we've had today, because I think that it stands entirely on its own merits, which are considerable. But the question we've asked ourselves is so what? And the sort of trite answer is, so we need to think about this quite hard, don't we, and probably do something about it too. And that's what we've been telling ourselves, or certainly the Army has been telling itself increasingly vocally, to go back to where I started, since Patrick Sanders first stood up and said, look, publicly we need to have this discussion and we need to get on and do something about it. So what I am going to do before a few very final closing remarks is just give you 3 anecdotes to just have a think about, because I think that they set where we are as an army, where you are as an army, into context. And the first was, I guess, 2005, something like that, in the conference room of Headquarters Field Army, whatever it was called in those days, in Wilton, in an all-day discussion workshop chaired by the assistant chief at the time. I can't remember the exact date, but it was post 9/11, 2001. It was post Afghanistan, beginning of the intervention, post Iraq, and the decisions being made by the British government, resource-driven, into the army about, okay, so where do we put our emphasis of effort here? And the upshoot of the conversation, very robustly driven by the assistant chief, was that Afghanistan is that's where we were going to succeed. So driven that the decision was made to call the effort to mount operations in Afghanistan in a renewed way with renewed vigour, because remember, to start with, there was a very successful regime removal, special forces driven operation that then became a lacuna as the effort switched to Iraq. And as the effort switched back to Afghanistan, there was a decision to call it Op Entirety. And I remember the robustness of the discussion. And to my mind, some of the wiser heads in the room were saying, sorry, General, you just can't call it that. It might well be Operation Really Bloody Important, but Operation Entirety means that you are now abrogating the duty of the army to be able to do all sorts of other stuff explicitly, including heavy lifting major war, in order to succeed in Afghanistan. And the answer was, yes, absolutely, you idiot, don't you get it? That's what we need to do within the resources we've got to make sure that is so. And for a period of some 15 years or so, up until Op Pitting in 21, it was called, the effort behind the operation was called Op Entirety. So what? So I think that and it's a phrase of my own invention that I'm very fond of because I think it's funny. We stopped being a war machine and started being a coin-operated machine. There is now a generation of people who, nobody comes through here on the commanding officer's designate course who's lived through anything other than Op Entirety as their way of doing war. And those of you who served, and almost everybody above the rank of sergeant and above the rank of captain, served in Afghanistan and or in Iraq. That experience was visceral. Those of us who did, there's still that same grime under the fingernails. You can smell things that are, you know, it absolutely. And because it was so visceral, that experience is deep and it affects how you think. And you put that on top of 15, 20 years of policy, and we have found ourselves in a world where we had genuinely forgotten our purpose. Why we could have had 10 years of discussions in this room amongst generals with Jonathan Trevor about what the purpose of the army was when it's patently clear. And so when Patrick Sanders came in, his absolute central line was, so we need to relearn it. We have a duty to relearn it. And nothing that I've heard this morning does anything other than encourage us to make sure that we understand that, and that we look ourselves good and hard in the mirror and say, we collectively, you collectively, the British Army, were part of that decision, that entirety decision. And actually your base responsibility is to be ready to fight and win the nation's wars from the land. And that ain't going to change and never has changed. And just because that decision was made in that conference room doesn't mean that it had changed. It just means that people decided to ignore it, and you need to get back into a different space. And I think everything that we've heard today has reconfirmed that in my mind. Second anecdote, and I think that this is contextually really important, and I wish I could remember her name, and I've searched on the web to find it, but there was a fantastic interview I saw about 10 years ago, what prescience this wonderful lady had, with the sweetest of old ladies, who would have given you tea and bickies in thin china, who was one of the hardest bastards I've ever heard in my life, who was an SOE agent throughout the war, who was it was an oral history attempt to gather her her experience. And she spoke with great clarity about what she'd done, but she rambled around in a wonderful way about lots of other thoughts that her lifetime of wisdom had given her. And in that conversation, she used the expression repeatedly, this blessed generation. And the reporter, the academic that was interviewing her, came back to her on that towards the end. And they'd sort of concluded the interview, but he sort of came back and said, so what did you mean by that? And she said, oh, you know, I mean the kids, by which I mean sort of people, you know, in their 40s and younger, by which now is bar me, everybody else in this room. She said, they are so blessed, aren't they? And yet, they all seem so worried, don't they? They're so anxious. And yet when you ask them what they're anxious about, for my generation, their anxieties, though genuinely real to them, deeply felt, are so petty. Oh, that they should have the blessed privilege of being worried above everything else about how other people see them than about the life that they're likely to live. And I thought, it's seared into my memory that somebody could make such a statement, deep on so many levels. And the so what of that is I think that she's absolutely right, and I think that those fears are deeply genuine. You know, as a father and a grandfather, deeply genuine, deeply held, and yet they're on another level. And we've been blessed and privileged, even those of us that have gone out and stood ready in the darkness, etc., for those deep worries that so much the rest of the world has suffered and is suffering, to be so distant. And therefore our polity, the context in which you serve, and the context that you serve, simply doesn't operate mentally in that space of concern and threat and worry, and are desperate to find out who's the traitor that's going to win or get voted out tonight, and who's going to be on next year's roll-up of Strictly Come Dancing, but actually not that desperately interested in the security situation facing you as a profession. And that means if the polity isn't interested, neither are the politics and the politician. And therefore, regardless, back to point one of whether you shift your mindset into how you're going to approach and deal with that, helping them to shift their mindset in a way that doesn't label anxiety unwelcome on top of other anxieties, such that they become part of your endeavour in a responsible and useful way, I think is a huge order, but it is your, ladies and gentlemen, responsibility. That's part of what you need to be able to do to get yourselves into a better place. And why does that concern me? And why do I say it's your responsibility? Third anecdote, and I'm very definitely not giving you any indication as to who I'm talking about. But in my local village just before Christmas, so just after the fall of the regime in Syria, I bumped into a defence official who I had no idea lived anywhere near me. It turned out that he didn't live that near me, but just knew that there was a particularly good butcher's and a particularly good wine shop, and was picking up a goose and some very nice wine for Christmas. A very senior defence official who saw me and said, "Oh, Sharpie, I didn't know you lived here," and stopped and we had a chat. And because it was a shop chat, his wife very quickly got fed up and wandered off, and left us standing in the street talking about the world in general. And what struck me, I mean profoundly struck me, was his take on Russia, which was, it's so serious, fascinating, isn't it? Absolutely. But that's not the issue, is it? Because we're grown-ups, and we understand that what's really important is what the results of Syria are and the implications of Syria. And Sharpie old boy, isn't it fascinating that Russia has been shown to be so much weaker than we thought it was? And his message was, so we don't have as much to worry about as we thought we did. We've got more space to work in than we thought we did. And his parting words are, in this festive season, don't you find that reassuring? And off he went on his way, no doubt reassured and happy. And I got back into my car with my goose, and thought, I'm not reassured at all. I'm actually, that frightens the living daylights out of me. Because if somebody sitting in the heart of Whitehall can read what I read as instability, as fear, honour and interest, boy, are they all engaged in all of this, and by mistake, and everything that we talked about in the first and second sessions this morning, leaving me to think, please listen to Patrick, please listen to Rowley, please, polity, army, listen to the warnings. Wake up and smell the vodka, as we said 11 years ago in our first CHACR publication, which Whitehall asked us not to publish because it was going to be provoking in a world of détente. And fortunately we're independent, so we published anyway. It left me feeling much less comfortable, much less secure, much more determined that in sessions such as this, we damn well do need to think about so what. We really do need to talk about it. And from the bottom of the army through to the top of the army generals, we need to be, sorry to be hectoring, we need to find ways of engaging. We need to find ways of discussing. We need to find ways of not sounding like we're on a single agenda, but in just saying we have a responsibility to have this discussion. And that will give you the context in which that you can do your own thinking. Rant over, and I provide you with no answers, as is normal in this place. But for me, those three things set the context in what we've been discussing. And as my old platoon sergeant used to say, makes you think, done it, sir. I hope it does. So, I hope you've had a really useful day today. Please help yourself to the publications that we put there on the way out. They're there for you to take away. Please do, if you don't already use it, and I'm guessing by the fact that you're here or that you're listening to us or watching online, please do dip in online. The British Army Review readership over the last 18 months has gone up to over 200,000 readership now. Interestingly, our second largest readership used to be in the USA, is now in Russia. After we published the special on breaking the stalemate in Ukraine, it changed overnight. And they're pushing close to the British readership now, which is interesting. In early May, our next conference is the launch of this book, Stormproofing, which I hope you've read the How Armies Grow that the then Brigadier Rowley Walker asked the CHACR to write as its first book. This takes that thinking to a next level, not in terms of cleverness, but in terms of sort of broadness and thinking about generalship, thinking about the human relationship with technology and what that might mean. And if you take the two volumes together, we hope that they're helpful foundational thinking for how the army might like to be ready to fight and win the nation's wars on land. I meant to wave a copy of How Armies Grow at you. I'm told that my assistant has one that he prepared earlier. So the problem with this is it's an academic book, and therefore I'm told by generations of soldiers costs far too much. This was read by Patrick and then again by Rowley before they took over, just to remind themselves of what they were preaching. So please do have a read of that. This we've tried to do so that it is much more affordable, so there's no excuse for not reading it. The foreword is written by the Chief of the General Staff, making it quite clear, I read it this morning, that he expects people to read it. So we've tried to make it affordable so that you can. Please also listen to the podcasts driven by the Army Sergeant Major's desire for us to produce more stuff that is more accessible. We've taken his direction and led by Peter Apps, with whom many of you will be familiar, Facing Coming Storms. There's a theme here, isn't there? The first of which has just hit the web, or will come out next week, as will this recorded session. So thank you all again for coming. Thank you for joining us online. Those of you that couldn't make it in person, thank you, the speakers, for giving us your time on the panels. Thank you, the organisers, for doing all the heavy lifting. And as you venture out into storm, air, wind, topically enough, as we talk about coming storms, may I suggest that both literally and metaphorically you will buckle up for a rough ride. So what for the British Army? Well, I can't do better than offer Radio 4's Today programme Thought for the Day that I listened to as I drove up today from a Buddhist Swami who very aptly used the approach of Storm Airwin as a metaphor for the global context and his view of how we spiritually needed to be preparing ourselves for what was coming. And his closing line, which I loved, was, "When the storm approaches, strengthen the gates and become strong like the mountains." Yeah, spot on, pal. Good advice indeed. So as you all head off on your separate ways to show my true age in the great closing line of Hill Street Blues, be careful out there. Thanks very much.